See, one of the things that Carl Rogers said, the psychologist, was that a good way to have a discussion with someone is to tell them what you think they think until they think that what you said reflects what they said. But look, this is a really useful thing to know if you're ever having a discussion with an intimate partner, for example, is that you have to put their argument back to them in terms they agree with. It's very difficult. So I'm going to try to do that. And so the first thing is, I think that partly what's driving you, if this is accurate, is that you want to ground a structure of ethics in something solid. And there's two things you want to avoid, two catastrophes, let's say. One is the catastrophe that you identified with religious fundamentalism, and the other is the catastrophe that's associated with moral relativism. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, good. It's crucially important that we get this right. Now, and that's something that I think we really agree on, because I've conceptualized that slightly different than you, and that might be relevant, but I think of that as a pathology of order and a pathology of chaos. So the terminology is slightly different, but I think we're working on the same axis. So that's the first thing. And then in order to do that, it seems to me, that's your first priority. And then maybe your second priority is something like, you see undue suffering in the world, plenty of it, and you would think that things would be better if that wasn't the case, and that this morality, whatever it's going to be, is at least going to ground itself in part on the presupposition that the less undue suffering in the world, the better. Is that also reasonable?
Yeah, I would just add to that the positive side of the continuum as well. So as you know, the phrase I use, or the word I use for this is well-being.
Yep.
And I know from having, I don't think we spoke about this on my podcast, but from having seen you in other interviews, I think you think that phrase doesn't capture everything one could reasonably want. But I think it does. I mean, it's an elastic suitcase term for a reason, and it's actually, in reading your book, I realize there's a point of contact here, because you use the word being, capital B, being, as though it were imbued with significant gravitas. So for me, and I agree with you, that's an appropriate use of being. And for me, well-being is simply just the positive side of being. There's the negative side, the suffering we want to mitigate. But I think however good consciousness can be in this universe, that the well-being for me subsumes all of those possibilities.
Okay. Well, so I focused on the suffering element, I think, as I've done in my own work, because I actually think it's easier to zero in on in some sense. Like, I think it's easier for people, and I think you lay out the argument in the moral landscape kind of like this. I think it's easier perhaps to gain initial agreement between people on what might constitute a generalized ethic, to concentrate on what we don't want. Yeah. I'm not saying that what we do want is unimportant, but it seems to me to be harder to get a grip on. We don't want Auschwitz. We don't want the Gulag Archipelago. So, and there are...
And I would add, to just closing the door to moral relativism here, those who do want Auschwitz are wrong to want Auschwitz. I mean, it's obviously right. Auschwitz only happened because some people did want Auschwitz, not the victim side, but the perpetrator side. And so, crucially for me is the claim that I'm a realist. I'm a moral realist, and what realism means is that there are right and wrong answers to questions of this kind, and you cannot know what you're missing. In fact, we almost certainly don't know what we're missing on questions of human value, and our job is to discover just how good life can be and just what variables are making it needlessly horrible, and to mitigate all of that and live in a better and better world.
Okay. Well, so. Okay, so that's a lot of points of agreement. So I also believe that there is a catastrophe of arbitrary moral injunction, and that there's a catastrophe of moral relativism, and that has to be dealt with, and that there are genuine differences between the proper way of behaving morally and the improper way of behaving morally. And I think that they are grounded in human universals, even though there's a wide amount of variation. So that's a lot of points of agreement, right? So we know that there's two things we want to avoid, conceptually speaking, which is the moral relativism and this kind of moral absolutism that's grounded in an arbitrary statement of facts that you identify with religious fundamentalism. I would identify that with fundamentalism more generally, not with religious fundamentalism per se, because I see it also happening in secular states, let's say, like Nazi Germany or so it doesn't seem to be religious fundamentalism per se that's crucial to your argument.
No, it's not. So that just to close the loop on that, the only reason why I would focus on religion in particular there is that religion is the only language game wherein fundamentalism and dogmatism, dogmatism is not a pejorative concept. Dogma is a good word, specifically within Catholicism, and the notion that you must believe things on faith, that is in the absence of compelling evidence that would otherwise cause a rational person to believe it, that in a religious context is considered a feature, not a bug. Elsewhere, we recognize it to be a bug, and that's why the unique focus on religion.
All right, so is it reasonable to assume that we've already established, at least in principle, that there's an association between the totalitarian regimes, let's say,
and dogmatism, yeah.
And the dogmatism that characterizes religious belief.
Yeah.
What do you think, although at least in principle, the secularist totalitarian states and the religious fundamentalist totalitarian states do differ in one important regard, which is that the religious types ground their axioms in God and the secular totalitarian types don't. And so there's got to be something about totalitarianism per se that's independent of, that's associated with religious belief in the manner that you just described, but that's not particularly associated with the belief in God. There's something that makes them, that's a commonality between them. And so do you have any sense of what that might be?
Well, I think one has to acknowledge that there's something uniquely pernicious, at least potentially, about religious beliefs, because they have the otherworldly variable, the supernatural variable, you're going to get everything you want after you die, so this life doesn't matter issue. That allows for a kind of misbehavior that is especially
so it seems that the claim would be that if you put forward axiomatically your claim that God exists, then you can use that claim to justify whatever arbitrary atrocities your system might throw off.
Yeah, I guess the only point I was making there is that not all dogmas are created equal. I mean, some dogmas are on their face more dangerous and more divisive.
But what I'm curious about specifically is, because it seems to me that the dogmas of the USSR and the dogmas of Nazi Germany were as pernicious as any religious dogmas. And they may also share important features with pernicious religious dogmas, but it isn't clear to me from your perspective what those commonalities would be.
Well, so, I mean, in some ways you're recapitulating an argument I've made, and this is an argument that I would make against you were you to claim, as you have elsewhere, that atheism is responsible for the greatest atrocities of the 20th century. The idea that Stalinism and Nazism and fascism were expressions of atheism simply doesn't make any sense. I mean, in the case of fascism and Nazism, it doesn't make any sense because the fascists and the Nazis, by and large, were not even atheists. I mean, Hitler wasn't an atheist, and he was talking about executing a divine plan, and he got lots of support from the churches, and the Vatican did nothing to stop him, and fascism, as you know, coexisted quite happily with Catholicism in Croatia and Portugal and Spain and Italy. So, but even in the case of Stalin, what was so wrong with that situation were all of the ways in which it so resembled a religion. You had a personality cult, you had dogmatism that held sway to a point where apostasy and blasphemy were killing offenses. You know, the people who didn't toe the line were eradicated, and so to take a more modern example, North Korea is a religious cult. It just doesn't happen to be a one that is focused on the next life or supernatural claims of magic.
So what would be the defining characteristics of a religious totalitarian movement that would make it different from a non-religious totalitarian movement?
Well,
because there's aspects that are similar.
They're very similar. I mean, the problem is dogmatism. The overarching problem is believing things strongly on bad evidence. And and the reason why dogmatism is so dangerous is that it is it doesn't allow us to revise our bad ideas in real time through conversation. Dogmas have to be enforced by force or the threat of force, because the moment someone has a better idea, you have to shut it down in order to preserve your dogmas.
Okay. So the commonality seems to be something like claims of absolute truth at some level that you're no longer allowed to discuss.
Yeah.
So that's another point of agreement then, I would say, because part of the reason that I've been, let's say, a free speech advocate, although I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it, is because I think of free discourse, like the discourse that we're engaged in, as the mechanism that corrects totalitarian excess or dogmatic excess. And so I also think that systems of governance that are laying themselves out properly have to elevate the process by which dogmatic errors are corrected over the dogmas themselves, which is why I think the Americans are right, say, with regard to their First Amendment, is the process of free speech is the process by which dogmatic errors are rectified, and so it has to be put at the pinnacle of the hierarchy of values, something like that.
No, I think you and I totally agree about the primacy of free speech.
Okay, good. Okay, so that's another, fine.